Part 1. The Stench of Civilization. Paris before the sewers. Paris. Today the very name conjures images of elegance, of art and romance, of wide boulevards and glittering lights reflected on the Seine. But when the clock back several centuries and the reality was far less enchanting to understand the Paris of the 17th, 18th and even early 19th centuries, you must abandon the postcard illusions and brace yourself for a city that stank literally and figuratively. A city without a stomach. A city can be likened to a living organism. It consumes food, fuel and water, and it produces waste, copious amounts of it. In modern cities, that waste is hidden, whisked away underground in silent pipes, never to offend the senses. But in early modern Paris, the city had no stomach, no digestive system. Its excrement, human and animal alike, remained where it fell or was dumped into open streets, ditches, and rivers. By the 1600s, Paris had grown into one of Europe's largest urban centers, home to perhaps 300,000 people. The narrow, winding streets of the medieval city, never designed for such numbers, were perpetually congested and perpetually filthy. Refuse of every imaginable kind littered the ground. Rotting vegetable matter from kitchens, the carcasses of dead dogs and cats, heaps of horse dung from thousands of working animals, and, most pervasively, human waste. Public health as we understand it did not exist. Night soil collectors did operate, men tasked with emptying cesspits and hauling away excrement in barrels. But they were too few and often too reluctant to enter the festering pits beneath houses. Instead, many Parisians simply flung the contents of their chamber pots out of upper windows, often with a perfunctory cry of warning, "Gerlo, watch out for the water," to any unfortunate passerby below. The smell that defined as city visitors to Paris frequently remarked on its overpowering odor. One English traveler in the 18th century described arriving in the city as being assaulted by 1,000 uncleanly scents, as though the air itself were rotten. The smell was not confined to certain districts. It was everywhere. The Seine, far from being the romantic waterway of later centuries, was an open sewer. Tanneries, dye works, and slaughterhouses lined its banks, pouring blood, chemical runoff, and entrails directly into the river. In summer, when the water level dropped and heat baked the refuse, the stench became unbearable. The very architecture of Paris trapped the foulness. Narrow streets with overhanging upper stories formed dark, airless canyons where sunlight rarely penetrated and breezes could not sweep away the miasma. Gutters ran down the middle of many streets, ostensibly to carry away rainwater but in practice serving as open conduits for filth. During dry spells, the muck dried into dust, which carts and feet stirred into choking clouds. During rains, the slurry flowed ankle-deep. Living in filth for the ordinary Parisian, daily life meant constant contact with dirt. Shoes and clothing were perpetually soiled, homes crawled with vermin, and diseases lurked everywhere. Typhoid, dysentery and cholera flourished in such conditions. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Perhaps half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Food was no refuge. Markets operated in the open air, often directly adjacent to cesspools or dunghills. Butchers slaughtered animals on site, letting blood flow into the street. Milk was routinely adulterated with water scooped from the Seine. Bread, the staple of the diet, was often gritty with impurities from poorly cleaned flour. For the poor, there was little choice but to endure. The wealthier classes fared only marginally better. They might live in taller houses, above the worst of the street-level filth, and employ servants to empty their privies discreetly. Yet even the aristocracy could not escape the odors or the illnesses born of their environment. Perfume, so often associated with French refinement, had its origins here. It was a desperate attempt to mask the pervasive stench of a city awash in waste. The cultural relationship with waste. What is perhaps most striking about pre-modern Paris is not just the presence of filth but the degree to which it was normalized. To modern sensibilities, such conditions seem intolerable, but for Parisians of the time, they were simply the backdrop of life. This was a world before germ theory, when disease was attributed to bad air, divine punishment, or even the alignment of the stars. While city authorities occasionally issued edicts to clean the streets or regulate waste disposal, enforcement was sporadic and ineffective. This acceptance was also partly due to the rhythm of urban life. Cities throughout Europe were dirty. London, Naples, and Amsterdam all had their foul corners, but Paris was particularly notorious because of its density, climate, and reliance on the Seine. Moreover, the city's cultural and political importance meant that its problems were magnified in the eyes of contemporaries. It was the beating heart of France, but it beat in a body riddled with infection. Enter the night soil men. One of the few organized responses to urban waste came from the profession of vidangers or night soil men. These were the laborers who emptied cesspits and hauled excrement to dumping grounds outside the city. It was a miserable, dangerous job. Cesspits were sometimes filled with poisonous gases that could asphyxiate workers. Explosions were not unheard of when lanterns ignited methane. The pay was relatively good for unskilled labor, but the social stigma was immense. Night soil men were shunned, forced to live on the city's outskirts, and often barred from marrying into respectable families. Yet they were essential. Without them, Paris would quite literally drown in its own waste. Even so, their efforts barely kept pace with the city's growth. By the 18th century, Paris was producing thousands of tons of excrement annually, and the infrastructure to deal with it remained medieval. The seeds of change despite the general tolerance for filth. The Enlightenment began to sow seeds of reform. As ideas of rationalism and progress spread, so too did the notion that a city could be improved. Physicians began to suspect that cleanliness might have some relation to health, even if they did not yet understand microbes. Urban planners dreamed of wider streets, better drainage, and centralized waste management. The day sciences conducted studies on sanitation, and pamphleteers decried the great shame of France that was its capital's condition. Still, change was slow. The inertia of tradition, the costs involved, and the sheer scale of the problem meant that Paris remained, well into the 19th century, a city defined by its smells. It would take a combination of political will, engineering genius, and public outrage to finally transform it, a story we will explore in the next part. Part 2. The struggle for cleanliness. Early reforms and public outrage. The stench had become unbearable. By the early 18th century, Paris had grown beyond the medieval city of narrow, winding lanes. It was a burgeoning metropolis of nearly 500,000 souls. Yet its infrastructure remained trapped in the Middle Ages. The Seine, once a source of life and trade, had turned into a sluggish receptacle of filth. Bridges crossing the river were choked with refuse thrown directly from the windows of houses built upon them. In the height of summer, the smell rising from its waters could make passers-by gag, but Paris could not ignore the problem forever. Disease was becoming a silent enemy. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the plague haunted the city, often linked to foul water and poor sanitation. Physicians, though still limited in their understanding of germs, began to suspect a connection between the miasmas, the bad airs rising from rotting waste, and the frequency of deadly epidemics. The people too began to revolt in their own way. Protests erupted, not in the form of political uprisings, but in the cries of markets refusing to open near fetid streets, in landlords whose tenants fled from unbearable living conditions, and in wealthy citizens demanding cleaner boulevards for their carriages to travel without splashing through muck. Royal attention. The birth of municipal sanitation. The turning point came when the monarchy itself could no longer ignore the filth. The grandeur of Versailles stood in stark contrast to the squalor of Paris, and foreign visitors frequently remarked on the city's stench. It was an embarrassment to a kingdom that prided itself on elegance and refinement. In 1740, under Louis XV, the city appointed its first corps of inspectors of cleanliness, tasked with overseeing the removal of waste from public streets. These inspectors wielded little real power at first, but their presence signaled a shift. The filth of Paris was now officially a matter of state concern. New regulations soon followed. Residents were ordered to collect household waste in containers rather than throwing it from their windows. The notorious cry of "Garde l'eau," a warning shouted before tossing a chamber pot's contents into the street, was banned. Street sweeping crews were organized, albeit sporadically, and gutters were cleaned with more regularity. Yet these efforts were uneven and often undermined by corruption. Contracts for waste removal were handed to favored individuals who pocketed funds without delivering results. Resistance from within. Not everyone welcomed these reforms. Many Parisians resented what they saw as royal intrusion into their daily lives. The poor, who could barely afford food, scoffed at the idea of paying extra for waste disposal. Some landlords refused to comply, preferring to let their tenants shoulder the burden. Others actively sabotaged the system, dumping waste in secret under cover of night. The city's infrastructure was still woefully inadequate, even with more organized removal. There were few proper disposal sites, and refuse often ended up in open pits just beyond the city walls, creating new centers of stench that the wind carried back into Paris. The voice of public outrage. By the late 18th century, however, public sentiment was shifting. Paris was evolving into a hub of Enlightenment thought, and with that came a new emphasis on public health and civic responsibility. Writers and philosophers began to comment on the appalling state of the city's hygiene. Pamphlets circulated, lambasting the monarchy and the municipal government for their failure to provide basic cleanliness. "How can we speak of progress?" one anonymous writer asked in 1776, "when our citizens must wade through human excrement to reach the baker?" The press took up the cause. Satirical cartoons depicted aristocrats gliding through filth in gilded carriages, while commoners trudged knee-deep in muck. Physicians called for underground sewer systems modeled on those of ancient Rome. Even foreign dignitaries joined in the criticism. Visitors from London and Amsterdam, cities that had begun to implement more modern waste management, described Paris as a backward, disease-ridden capital. Revolution in the gutters. The French Revolution brought more than political upheaval. It brought renewed calls for urban reform. Revolutionary leaders, who decried privilege and championed equality, viewed the filthy conditions of Paris as a symptom of royal neglect and social injustice. Committees were formed to address public health, and for the first time, serious plans for an extensive sewer network were drafted. The old system of cesspools and open drains would be replaced by underground tunnels to carry waste away from the city. But revolution also brought chaos. Wars, economic instability, and political purges delayed progress. While some new drains were constructed, and certain districts saw improvements, much of Paris remained as foul as ever. Still, the idea had taken root. Cleanliness was no longer just a matter of personal pride or royal image. It was a civic necessity. Seeds of a sanitary future. By the dawn of the 19th century, the groundwork had been laid for the great transformations that would follow under Napoleon and later, Baron Haussmann. Paris had begun, however haltingly, to grapple with the reality that its filth was killing its people. Public outrage had forced the hand of monarchs and revolutionaries alike, turning the once ignored muck of the streets into a political and social issue of the highest order. The struggle for cleanliness had only begun, but the people of Paris were no longer content to suffer in silence. The smell of the city, once accepted as an unavoidable fact of life, had become a symbol of failure, and soon, that symbol would drive one of the most dramatic urban overhauls in history. Part 3. Engineering a New Paris. Sewers, Science, and the Battle for Modernity. By the mid-19th century, Paris was at a crossroads. The old medieval city, romanticized in paintings and literature, was rotting beneath its gilded facades. Disease stalked the overcrowded streets, and the stench of open drains clung to the air like a curse. Yet change was coming, not in the form of a slow, cautious reform, but as a grand, almost revolutionary reimagining of what a city could be. This was the era of engineering triumphs, when science, politics, and ambition converged to bury the foul legacy of centuries beneath stone, iron, and ingenuity. Haussmann's dream, rebuilding Paris from the ground up in 1853. A man named Georges Hugues Haussmann was appointed by Emperor Napoleon III as prefect of the Seine, effectively granting him control over the redesign of Paris. Haussmann was not an engineer by trade. He was a bureaucrat with a vision and a ruthlessness to match. His mission was not merely to improve sanitation but to transform Paris into the modern capital of the world. Wide boulevards would replace cramped alleys, parks would provide open air, and, beneath it all, an entirely new sewer network would serve as the city's lifeblood. Haussmann's critics accused him of destroying historic neighborhoods, but to him, the old Paris was a corpse to be dissected. Under his direction, entire districts were demolished to make way for new arteries of commerce and order. The sewers, however, were the true foundation of this urban surgery. Without them, no amount of architectural splendor could hide the stink of the past. 2. The visionary engineer Belgrand and the underground revolution. While Haussmann conceived the grand plan, the genius of execution belonged to Belgrand, an engineer of relentless dedication. Belgrand envisioned a sewer system unlike anything the world had seen, a vast subterranean labyrinth capable of draining, cleaning, and sustaining a city of millions. His design included vaulted tunnels large enough for boats to navigate, a marvel of practicality and foresight. Belgrand's sewers were not simply about removing waste. They represented a new philosophy of urban living. They were engineered to be inspected, maintained, and even toured, a testament to transparency and modern pride. Where previous generations had hidden their filth, Belgrand flaunted his solution. Soon, foreign dignitaries, scientists, and curious citizens were descending into the underworld of Paris to marvel at the clean, flowing waters where once there had been only stagnant rot. 3. Science versus superstition. The battle over germs. Despite the progress in engineering, science still faced skepticism. The dominant theory of disease, miasma or bad air, had long shaped public health policy. Many believed that foul odors themselves were the cause of sickness, and while there was some truth in the association of smell and filth, the actual agents of disease were invisible. Enter Louis Pasteur, a brilliant French chemist whose germ theory would revolutionize medicine. Pasteur's research in the 1860s began to show that microorganisms caused illness, not vapors. His findings supported the case for clean water and effective waste removal, providing the scientific justification that Belgrand sewers were more than just civic beautification. They were a matter of life and death. Still, resistance persisted. Some politicians balked at the cost, others clung to outdated beliefs, and many citizens resented the disruption of construction. Yet cholera epidemics, which had previously ravaged Paris, began to decline. The evidence was undeniable. Modern sanitation worked for the sewers as a symbol, pride, progress, and propaganda. By the 1870s, Paris's new sewers were not just a utility. They were a symbol of modernity. The city invited journalists and foreign visitors to tour the underground tunnels, presenting them as a triumph of French engineering. Guidebooks praised the system, and postcards depicted the vaulted chambers like cathedrals of cleanliness. For the government, the sewers became propaganda for progress. They represented the rationality of science, the power of the state, and the superiority of French civilization. Ironically, this underground world, born of necessity, became a point of national pride, even inspiring literary depictions. Victor Hugo's less famously set one of its climactic scenes in the Paris sewers, capturing both their filth and their grandeur. Resistance and the human cost. Yet this transformation came at a price. Entire neighborhoods were uprooted, displacing thousands of working-class Parisians. The poor, who had once lived in the dense, malodorous heart of old Paris, were pushed to the periphery. Haussmann's boulevards were not merely hygienic, they were also instruments of social control, making it easier for authorities to police crowds and suppress uprisings. Furthermore, the labor of building this modern marvel was brutal. Workers toiled in dangerous conditions, often in darkness, breathing in noxious fumes. Many suffered injuries or illnesses. Their sacrifices were largely invisible, overshadowed by the glory of the finished product. Via the legacy of innovation by the late 19th century, the Paris sewer system had become a model for cities worldwide. London, Vienna, New York, and countless others looked to Paris as proof that urban sanitation could conquer disease and filth. The city that once reeked of excrement was now a beacon of hygiene and modern living. But beyond its practical achievements, the sewer system embodied a profound shift in human thought. It was a victory of science over superstition, planning over chaos, and collective responsibility over individual neglect. In burying its waste, Paris had, in a sense, buried the medieval mindset that had tolerated squalor as inevitable. Part 4. The Triumph and the Price. How Paris finally became the City of Light. By the late 19th century, Paris stood transformed. The reeking gutters, the fetid air of the Seine, and the dark underworld of waste had begun to vanish, replaced by a network of underground arteries as vital and intricate as the veins of the human body. But this triumph of engineering and public health did not come without its costs: financial, social, and even cultural. The story of Paris's emergence as the ville, the City of Light, was as much about sacrifice as it was about innovation. 1. Haussmann's Paris. The grand vision, the first true revolution in Parisian urban planning, came under Georges Haussmann, appointed by Napoleon III in 1853 to remake Paris into a modern capital. His sweeping plan cut wide boulevards through the dense medieval neighborhoods, demolished slums, and laid down the foundations for a new sewage network to serve the growing metropolis. Beneath the grand avenues lined with chestnut trees, Haussmann's engineers laid vast underground tunnel sewers that were not only functional but monumental in their scale. These were designed to carry away not just stormwater but the wastewater of millions of Parisians, keeping it far from their homes and ultimately out of their drinking supply. Yet Haussmann's vision was not universally loved. The transformation displaced thousands of residents, erased centuries-old streets, and incurred staggering costs. Critics accused him of authoritarianism and extravagance. Still, when the floods no longer brought cholera, when fountains ran clear, and when the scent of spring blossoms overpowered the stench of human waste, few could deny the benefits. 2. The technological triumph. The Paris sewers became a marvel of the modern world. Engineers such as Belgrand, Haussmann's collaborator, created a labyrinth of tunnels that could be navigated by boats for maintenance and inspection, a system so advanced that it inspired cities across Europe and beyond. By the 1870s, Paris had also embraced the other great revolution of the age: artificial lighting. Gas lamps illuminated the boulevards at night, transforming the city into a glittering stage of nightlife and modernity. Visitors marveled at how the City of Light banished both darkness and disease. Tourists could even take guided tours of the sewers, descending into the underworld to witness the mechanical arteries of civilization. Victor Hugo, in Les, immortalized this hidden world, calling it both a place of filth and salvation. 3. The human cost. Who paid for progress? Behind the gleam of gaslights and the grandeur of clean boulevards lay a harsher reality. The reforms were financed through heavy taxation and debt, burdening the working poor who had little voice in the city's transformation. Many of those displaced by Haussmann's demolitions ended up in crowded suburbs, far from the clean water and lights of central Paris. The sewer workers themselves lived lives of danger and hardship. They labored in the dark, wet tunnels, exposed to toxic gases, disease, and the constant risk of collapse. While Parisians strolled carefree above, the men below kept the city alive, largely invisible and uncelebrated for. The cultural shift. Paris as a symbol of modernity. With its boulevards illuminated and its filth contained, Paris became the world's showcase of modern urban living. The 1889 Exposition Universelle, which unveiled the Eiffel Tower, presented a city at the forefront of science, technology, and art. Yet this victory over darkness and disease also marked the end of a certain intimacy. The old Paris of crooked alleys, shaded courtyards, and hidden corners romanticized by poets and painters was gone. In its place stood a city of spectacle and control, where light revealed everything and left little room for mystery. 5. The legacy. Light and lessons. By the turn of the 20th century, Paris's triumph over sewage and disease had made it a global model for urban planning. Cities from London to New York sought to replicate its sewer systems and public health reforms. The phrase City of Light came to symbolize not just illumination but enlightenment, progress, and the triumph of reason over chaos. But this story also carries warnings for the present. The progress always comes at a price. That infrastructure is as much about politics as it is about pipes, and that beneath every modern city lies an invisible network upon which its life depends. The Paris sewers, still maintained and still functioning today, remain a testament to human ingenuity and to the generations who endured the stench, the sickness, and the struggle so that future Parisians might breathe easier. Epilogue: a city redeemed standing on a bridge over the Seine today. With the Eiffel Tower glittering in the night, it is hard to imagine the city's fetid past. But it is there, beneath the cobblestones and behind the facades, a reminder that the city of light was forged not just in the glow of lamps but in the dark, dirty labor of transformation. Paris's journey from a city of sewage to a city of light is, ultimately, a story of human persistence, of belief that cities can evolve, that suffering can yield to science, and that even the foulest rivers can be made to run clean again.